Hello, beautiful humans. How are you this morning? I'm on Eastern Standard Time, Pacific Standard Time, Mountain Time, whatever time I need to be on. But my name is Passion, and I'm going to try to explain my journey in about 10 to 12 minutes, which is impossible for someone like me, but I'll do my best. Um, so, when Yarrow mentioned materials management, that really has been my focus. So, I grew up going to the landfills with my dad. He had a maintenance company in West Michigan, in Grand Rapids. And what was interesting and unique, even as a 7 or 8 year old, he had these crew of guys. And so they had seasonal work for snow plowing, waste removal, industrial mowing. And sometimes before school or after school, I would take a trip with him to the landfills, and I'm like, even as a 7 or 8 year old kid, it just didn't make sense to me. I'm like, Dad, are we just gonna go to all these places and keep burying things and dumping things? But who knew spiritually that that was just something that was planted in my soul? It was a question I had as a kid, but I had no idea that later on in life that I would be focusing on diversion. Okay, so let me give you a quick story. So when I left undergrad, that was 2000, finished undergrad 2001, I moved back to Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids was investing hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure, building more efficient buildings. The Green Building chapter, they set up a chapter there at that time around 03, 04. And so what was unique about this situation is some of my friends' parents who are general contractors and construction managers said, Passion, what are you thinking about? What are you going to do? What's your next move? And so I said, I'm thinking about taking over part of my dad's business, but I want to make sure that I'm doing this the right way. And so they invited me to these meetings where the construction managers, general contractors, the designers, architects, everybody was coming together to decide on how they were going to build this new infrastructure. And that was everything from geothermal systems to taking old, like core existing shell buildings and bringing them back to life, gardens, rooftop gardens, efficient water systems, you name it. So one, I was inspired at that time in my life because I looked at waste as being waste, but I soon found out that if we managed it properly, then we could put a dollar value on that waste, right? Or at least the materials. And so I was a part of a couple of green building projects. And so I'm going to try to move through this fast. Those green building projects, I was responsible for all the materials, right? So if there were shingles for houses that asphalt companies could use to crush back up and put them in the ground, if there was crushed concrete, we can get that back to those who are producers of concrete. If it was wood, if it was steel, I was just trying to make sure that we managed all these materials. One, getting them back to producers, but two, getting people to think differently about how to build or what do these materials really mean to us individually, as corporations, et cetera. So with that being said, I grew up and still close to a lot of my friends in Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids was very conservative. Dutch, Christian Reform, tons of Republicans. I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. But what I will say is what I found out, whether things are polarizing and divided in this country, the one thing that I have witnessed is people have commonalities, right? Principles, values, integrity. And I began to realize that I want to be a bridge to a lot of solutions. This is not about, focusing on racism all the time, but you do have to have conversations about racism. This is about what is sustainability truly? And so I leave that question with you as I talk about my transition from Grand Rapids to Detroit. As I mentioned, Grand Rapids, around 20% Black population, mostly white, predominantly white community. Detroit was complete opposite. It's like 80% Black population. And I'm like, if I'm gonna make a difference with what I know, because again, I'm looking at these materials, the automotive community, contrary to what the news portrays, Detroit with a lot of blight, vacant properties. I didn't like the message that was being told, because the Detroit that I grew up going to, and the Chicago and the New Yorks, that region that I grew up visiting family and friends, I didn't understand why the story or how Detroit was being portrayed and why in such a negative image. Our arts culture is thriving. We have thousands of engineers, innovators, people who come out of that community who are still there. You got the big three there. So obviously you have to have people who are gifted and talented. And so we don't need to go back and talk about the pioneers and those who laid the foundation of automotive. But what I did realize is that the city wasn't planned properly. So if we were planning around the automotive and we're not looking at mass transit, I thought, how do I get through the doors of the automotive community and start talking about waste reduction? Well, it just so happened they were pushing a zero waste movement. And so I fell in love with this concept where, okay, if I could get a General Motors or Ford to allow me to take their food waste or any type of waste and start talking about what we can do with that waste, then I could probably get other brands to fall in line with this vision, right? And so, to make the long story short, when they asked me to get involved with the Ford ad, I had already been talking to children in K through 12 schools, trying to get curriculums developed around this. I was consulting for different corporations. But the point is, waste to resources was always in my mind. And so what happened was, I had to become a face of a movement, because when that Ford ad launched, I think there was 1 million views within like a couple of days. But Toby, the lead creative for Team Detroit and Ford, did a brilliant job, because he saw something in the future around social media. I've never been a fan of social media. I was not involved with social media, but when he produced that ad, he knew exactly what he was doing. So culturally, you have a Black woman branding a car that honestly, a lot of Black people worked for Ford, but I didn't really have a huge relationship with Ford at the time. My family worked for GM and Chrysler. But what I knew is, okay, if we have my natural hair, we tell this message about what other people are doing in other countries, we need to start thinking about synergy. The ecosystem is harmonious and diverse, so we need to bring together diverse people. If vulnerable communities are being impacted the most, but the people who live in those communities aren't helping to make the decisions, what's the problem here? The problem is we don't have enough diversity at the United Nations when we're making decisions. Believe it or not, at the White House, when it's time to make decisions, it's a majority of white males who are making decisions for people who they don't relate to. And I'm not saying you can't relate, and I'm not saying that all white men cannot relate to Black and brown people in different communities. What I'm saying is, when it comes to colonialism, when it comes to slavery, you have to unpack these terms. You have to unpack these issues. I am a descendant of a sharecropper and a slave. So if you're having a conversation with me about agriculture, I want to unpack it and talk about, one, how do we come together to address these issues? But unlocking equity doesn't mean talking about it. Unlocking equity means bringing together like-minded people from diverse backgrounds so we can figure this thing out. Climate and climate change is the one thing that I believe that all of us should be coming together to create solutions around this. And I'm a living example of being this kid from Grand Rapids who had exposure to different cultures at a young age. Japan was the first country I went to, and it changed my life. But I want to say this. In this journey around waste, my objective was, Pashon, you have to represent the people, all people, no matter who they are, where they come from. Keep that in mind, number one. Two, waste is such a low-hanging fruit, right? When people think about what you're throwing away, what goes to the landfills, I said, let me unpack this issue, but let me make it relatable to all people. So it became a mission of, if we do something as simple as sending 20 to 30% of food waste to the landfill, and we keep wasting and these corporations keep wasting, how do I live as an example of a model for the world? Or how do I make this model replicable? How do we replicate a model? How do we accelerate, as Anne pointed out? What do we need to do in that acceleration? Because things are moving so exponentially. And so even in the MIT Media Lab, I saw all of these interdisciplinary projects and people from Asia and Africa and the States and all coming together to solve solutions. Got it. I knew this was going to be hard to get done in 10, 12 minutes. But so make the long story short, you know, between the Media Lab, understanding tech, understanding waste issues, I said, okay, how do we build markets around this? So at MIT Media Lab, University of Michigan, we started looking at all of the biomass in the community, all the biomass nationally. What do we need to do? Do we promote anaerobic digestion, biodigesters, sustainable aviation fuel? Let's do it all. Let's unpack this materials management issue and start pinpointing how do we track and measure and monitor waste. It's one of the easiest things to do. It's happening in other countries. They're converting organics to biofuels, right? We see it in the States here in different pockets throughout the communities, but we don't see it enough. Why? Because we don't really have the policies and the ordinances to support a lot of this work. So because I know I only have about a minute left, I'm going to leave you with this. As an advocate in environmental justice activist, I'm always trying to get people to see, okay, if you're living at home by yourself with a family, what can you do differently? How do you audit your performance and what you're doing? What kind of car are you driving? Can you walk more? Can you advocate in your community? Will you support those who are actually doing the work? That's part of the key. But what I would like to eventually see in communities are technologies that replace landfills, incinerators, and anything that's antiquated. Our supply chains are very antiquated. We can animate supply chains. We can track, measure, monitor, and do a better job as individuals as well as corporations. Does that mean 1 minute or 2 minutes? That means I'm done. I could talk to these folks forever because they're all tuned in. This is beautiful. Okay, so 60 seconds. Just give me 60 seconds. Give me 60 seconds. So in my journey, did I experience racism? Yes. In my journey, did I meet a bunch of beautiful people of all nationalities, cultures? Absolutely. That gave me hope. The other thing that gave me hope was K through 12 schools. The youngest people, no matter what campus I go to, wherever I'm invited, they are the ones who are thinking, how can we play a role in making a difference, right? And so I want to say this to you. We have to continue to fight for ordinances locally and on our state level. Those politicians are just as important as the federal. We have to understand what it takes for a movement. Movements are supporting people who we relate to, some that we don't know. But if we come together in rooms like this and we share ideas and solutions, that is the key. We can push aside our differences because for generations to come, we have to be willing to create pathways for them. And what does that mean? Seeing yourself in the future, coming back to present day, and then implementing those changes. That's what we have to do. We have to be willing to come together to make the change. But I want to leave you with this. What can you do? What is your audit for your household, at work, wherever you're going? How do you make the difference? But what are you willing to do? What are you willing to sacrifice, right? We know that EV vehicles are great, but how are we going to get there in the energy transition? Are we only going to focus on electric vehicles and electric planes? Biofuels and sustainable aviation fuels and a lot of other practices aren't being discussed or talked about. Why? Because we're not sharing enough information. Energy transition could take another 10, 15 years. But in the meantime, we need to understand combustible engines, how the EV vehicle is going to work with 30 below temperatures. Can you go to Delta? And I'm ending on this. Delta Airlines, United Airlines has food waste. Why don't we set up an anaerobic digester and vessel right there for them to have a circular economy so they're burning cleaner fuels? There's a lot of different pathways that we can take. You guys are the answer. You're the solution. I didn't get enough time. I love you all. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Oh my goodness. Passion. Just a bright light.